Hello, everybody. I am Morgan, and I'm here to welcome you to our first ever episode of Conversion Conversations. And what we're starting is a series of events where we get two pros who are practiced in their field and have opposing viewpoints about a topic that is dear to the CRO and testing community. So I hope you'll join us on this journey to learn more, get involved, and challenge your assumptions. If you'd like to have the recording of today's session, please sign up for the link through the link, and you'll get that in your inbox in 24 to 48 hours. In the meantime, I hope you'll join us and raise your hand or pop your question in the chat, and I'll be taking a look at those. Today's topic is about meta-analysis, and I'm really pleased to have both Jonny and Jakub here. Jonny is the conversion director at Journey Further, and Jakub is the founder of GOODUI. And if you've been following either of them or you're into this topic, you'll know that they have a very good-hearted conversation pinging back and forth on LinkedIn. So we're very happy to have them here to talk more in depth about their stance on this topic. Today's format will be a brief introduction from each panelist, and they'll be able to ask a question of the other that they've always wanted to know the answer to. Then we'll open up and have open space and welcome your questions. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's see here. Jakub, why don't you take it away and give us a brief intro for yourself?
Sure. So hi everyone, under GOODUI, as Morgan, thank you for mentioning. One thing we do with experimentation teams is we seek patterns. So there's a belief that experiments have value for to be remembered and aggregated in some form, whether it's heuristics, practices, some better, some worse, that have a longer value than just for the experiment for that one company or for that one instance of an experiment, but they have some predictive accuracy, not 100%, that can inspire further experiments or can be decided with, and that's kind of what that project does. It's a way of aggregating, looking for similarities between some experiments to help experimentation teams.
Perfect. So that's your elevator pitch. Jonny, what's yours today?
Yeah. So I run the conversion division of a performance marketing agency. We run experimentation programs for clients, and mostly full service retainers. So we do everything for them in relation to experimentation. I think one of our USPs is that we try to approach experimentation more strategically than it often is done. So I very firmly believe that experimentation can and should support business strategy and sort of bigger decisions that businesses want to make, whereas traditionally it is, it's quite a spray and pray thing where people tend to just come up with a load of random ideas and churn through them and try and prioritize them. So that's a little bit how we differ.
Great. Thanks for that, Jonny. All right, so let's get the gloves off, so to speak. And Jonny, I'm going to start with you. What's your question, your burning question that you have for Jakub that you'd like to dive into?
Yeah, I think let's give a little bit of a background to how this came about. First of all, just for a bit of context, probably to set it up. So. We being an agency and having lots of different clients that we run lots of experiments for puts us in a position of having a lot of data on experiments across different kinds of clients. And we were actually wondering, should we build our own internal database of these experiments in order to do meta-analysis? Because I'm aware that that is a thing that agencies do. Some agencies do that have been around for quite a while. And so I just started to really think about it, and in the end decided that I didn't really see that much point in it. Anything that goes through my head like that, I end up posting it on LinkedIn, as anybody that follows me on LinkedIn will know. And that's where the discussion came from. And I guess just to explain why I think that goes back to what I was saying before, really, about experimentation and strategy. So the ostensible purpose of a meta-analysis database like that would be, as Jakub says, to find patterns in repeatable patterns that you can use. So, for example, if we did that, if we created a big database of experiments, we might find that removing the clickable nature of Trustpilot is always as predominantly a good thing to do. And so then you could use those patterns to run experiments on new clients and say, look, here's things that typically work, and so we'll go after them first. But the issue I have with that, I think, is...
So, Jonny, I'm going to break in here. What's your question for Jakub?
Well, I have to explain my thought process in order to ask the question. So really, if I get to it, the reason I think that doesn't work is because, if experimentation is supporting strategic business decisions, and those strategic business decisions are aimed at creating differentiation and creating uniqueness in a brand and in a proposition, then you want to be running experiments that are aimed at creating differentiation. But by default, a meta-analysis database like that is really the lowest common denominator. So you're really looking for the most average things that would work on any website ever. And so it's kind of like the worst kind of competitive analysis, in a way, where you're kind of copying what other people do. So my question would be, how can a meta-analysis database like that support more strategic decision-making and things that are aimed at furthering the differentiation of the brand or the proposition?
Very cool question, and a valid one. I completely agree. So first of all, I'm going to say I don't put, let's call them practices and experimentation at odds. I think we both share the view that experimentation is a wonderful tool for carving out uncertainty or generating confidence, validating learnings, including differentiating and finding some interesting advantages or higher optimums. But I think experimentation, there's this exploit versus explore trade-off. And I think differentiation is one way of attaining those higher optimums to the given metrics that businesses are after, whatever the metric is, right? Whether lifetime value, revenue, or something else. Exploiting doesn't necessarily have to be, or relying on something that has worked before doesn't necessarily have to push people down and keep people down at the average level. I think there are, when we start working with numerous companies, including, you have multiple clients, different clients or different companies have different starting positions, and some could be below average, right? They might be starting a new experimentation program and have missing calls to action or something, or let's say a call to action further, like 10,000 pixels further down, and that could be easy or highly probable, for example, pattern that could be applied that could lead to an improvement. And I would imagine that part of the effectiveness of an experimentation program is weighing, determining whether those are gains. And in fact, if that's a gain, then that's a gain, whether it comes from best practice or from whatever other source. I think that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would still be valid, an improvement for our company that you could generate.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there is definitely some value in sharing experiments, and like, you know, in people who run experiments, sharing those experiments, because they have interesting stories behind them. They, you know, I mean, I do it. I have a newsletter and I share experiments that we run that have interesting outcomes, and that sort of create that, you know, that cause you to think about things that are not what you would expect and things like that. So so there's definitely some value in that. I think the potential, well, there's one potential issue, is that people would use that data without testing it. So, and I think that's probably what quite a lot of people do with those kind of meta-analysis databases, is to go, well, if this pattern works quite well for various other companies, then we'll just do it. And that is, you know, that sort of really defeats the point, because as you're demonstrating with the pattern and with the data around the pattern, it's only showing a probability that it might be likely to work slightly better than other stuff, and not a definitive answer that will work on your website. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is that it's very hard to classify things in neat ways, and actually that's what we ran into when we started thinking about an internal meta-analysis database. Like, how do you actually classify things into patterns? Because the things don't neatly fall into those patterns. I mean, you know, there are certain kind of quite common tests that you might run, like the test on Trustpilot that I mentioned is a classic thing that, you know, a lot of companies like us will test. But other tests, there's complexity around what it is, why you're doing it, where it came from, and just sort of saying that it's the call to action on a product page or whatever. It doesn't really speak to why you're actually doing that and the meaning behind it. So it's quite hard to classify things that in a way that can be easily grouped. So those are, I think the main issues that I see.
Mm-hmm. And I think those are two valid points. And I think you touched upon the decision whether to test or just purely decide, right? That's one thing. I'd love to unpack that. Completely valid. And then the other thing is the difficulty of looking at 5 or 10 similar tests, and that similarity, yes, that will be subjective. You know, what you or others might count as like a Trustpilot test, there will be heterogeneity always. No two tests are alike, and there's some, I guess, subjective boundaries whether we kind of include that test or that set of tests in that analysis or not. Sure, that's difficult, and it's never the same, never completely unique. They are similar, right? I want to touch upon this experiment versus implementation thing. Again, my default is probably the same as yours. I would default to validating whatever decision gets made, ideally through an experiment. If we can't do an isolated experiment, maybe we can do a time series, an observational study, lower quality, less sensitivity, but still a valid method. And sometimes what I'm trying to say is that decision whether to experiment or to test, I would always respect the team doing that decision, because they might be, you know, a simple example might be maybe they just don't have enough testing sensitivity to run an experiment, or maybe the test will take 6 months, or they will have to lower their acceptance threshold to like a very low power or something like that, right? So there might be cases like that might push people to sometimes just make a decision. And in that case, if they are acting on something probable, that's, I think, a business case to at least take that and act on it.
What you mean
Yeah.
without testing?
Well, yes, I'm highlighting some cases that testing, although is the default and is a, if possible, always encouraged, but there might be cases where it's sometimes it takes a year to detect a 2% gain. That's, let's say that's an estimate for something.
Right. So that point being that if you're detecting patterns from companies that have higher volumes of data, then if you have lower volumes of data and you can't really test, then you can learn from those patterns. Is that the point?
That's one use case, to make a instant decision, right? If it's if it's not sensitive enough, and that if the experiment will just not see that change, right? And that's kind of where this meta-analysis stuff comes in, is because it aims for higher accuracy of estimates by combining more tests and increasing generalizability. So, for example, for some of the Trustpilot stuff, we actually have we have a handful of tests, and they're very neutral with very low estimates. So that's one direct use case. If someone has, 200 sales a month, I would not encourage a test like that on its own, based on that data. That's not right. So that's and that opens up the door to not everything can be tested or detected.
Yeah. So what are some of the strongest patterns that you've been able to detect in GOODUI?
Sure. So some things that come to mind are choices. We give it a weird name, gradual reassurance, but basically letting people choose something, express what they want to express before asking them, like buy or give us your information as a lead generation, right? In the context of e-commerce, it could be, hey, what kind of shoe size would you like? What kind of color would you like? What kind of deodorant kind of smell would you like? Or as a student, are you looking for part-time or for full-time, right? To respect their schedule. And some of these questions we find that people want to answer. They want to be given a chance to express. They feel reassured. Maybe that increases motivation, and then everything else follows. That's a highly replicable test example.
So do you mean limiting choices, or just presenting choices as an array? Like what would that be like, rather than just saying buy now, saying buy blue or buy red? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the context of Amazon, let's say, you're buying a hard drive. Do you want a 1 terabyte, 3 terabyte, half a terabyte, right? And having those choices prominent has a good effect on adds to cart sales and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's obviously a really valid thing that anyone should test. I would still be concerned about not testing it, because, and I think my where I'm coming from with this is kind of anecdotal in a way, but after many years of running experiments, the thing that I would say is the truest thing that I could tell anybody is that it's really hard to have these sorts of predictions. So just the reality of running tests is that you can be very convinced that something's going to work, and it can seem like completely and utterly logical, and you could have seen it work on like lots of other sites, but it can still have a dramatically opposite effect in certain situations, and without really any indication as to the reason why that's happening. So that's I think the key is that, and that's one of the things that I just think about a lot with a meta-analysis database, is that inherent in what you're doing is a lot of assumption about why the thing happens. So, if somebody runs a test and they record it as a pattern and that's what they've done, then you are assuming that the reason why that worked is the pattern that you've identified. However, it's entirely possible that it could be something completely and utterly different, such as it's changed the layout of the page and it's pushed something below the fold or above the fold, or it has just indicated some price to somebody that they weren't aware of before, or something like that. So that's the thing, is there's a big sort of assumption baked into it as to why that result is what you saw, that you're then matching with other assumptions like that, but actually you don't know that. And that is what happens when you really test things, is you realize that what you thought was going to happen didn't happen for a reason that you probably will never know. So that's the other issue, I think, that and actually, like, that isn't an issue if you sort of think of it as insight, and you think of it as a way to potentially think about new test ideas. But it is a problem when you're just going to do it without testing it, I think.
I'm going to agree that, again, the test is always the best for validating, right? It's the, right? It gives you the most confidence in your, whatever you're working on, in that scope for that client or whatever on that page or screen, that business. Yeah, there are some assumptions. But if we disregard, like, so one thing, like, there's nothing ever like 100% always will work, or, but equally, it also should be fair to say that if we have 7 similar tests with seven similar outcomes across 7 unique businesses, I think it would be dishonest to say that the probability is random, because that would mean we're disregarding all 7, like everything we have learned from those 7 experiments. I think it's statistically incorrect to say it's as the same as an unknown idea, because we already have gathered something. And I think that's where meta-analysis tries to can be done formally, which, by the way, I've never done a formal meta-analysis. I think, but it can be done also informally, where it gives us greater accuracy and expresses that as a better estimate that can go into testing, but not necessarily at all times, right? And
yeah, I think the other interesting thing is that the concept of meta-analysis comes from sort of heavily controlled scientific experimentation, I think, where, like, you would run a number of experiments in the exact same controlled way in order to demonstrate the repeatability of the finding. But the environmental factors of that experiment would be very heavily controlled. So, if you're thinking of like a chemistry experiment or something, the environmental aspects of it would be very heavily controlled. But with website testing, it's a completely and utterly different thing. Like, one website is radically and utterly different from another website, because it's got a very different audience and very different things going on, even if it seems relatively similar. Even if it's the same product, then it's still completely and utterly different in millions and millions of ways. So you just cannot control for it.
Right, and that's actually the beauty of it.
Okay. I'm just going to, we have a question here from Jonathan, and he's saying, how do you control for external variables in a data set and meta-analysis? Are you controlling for seasonality, or is it the expectation that the scale of the data set will normalize all those variables? And we have another one that just came in as well, but I'll leave y'all with that one to begin with.
Well, to me that sounds like very similar what Jonny has been, asking about. Like, okay, there's like differences. There may or may not be differences, and no two studies are ever alike. There's always going to be slightly different environments, slightly different variables, and I think the best that we can do is each study reports on that transparently. And then we decide whether we account for that or not.
Okay, thank you. So Reese has a question as well, and I'll read it here. If you were tasked with improving a landing page that was converting at 1%, let's imagine that the page is awful. There's no social proof, the headline is muddled, and the page loads slowly. Where would you start? Would you test the obvious problems, for example, best practices, or would you focus on gathering qualitative and quantitative data before even thinking about what to test?
Jonny?
So I dropped out and came back. I don't know if you noticed. We had a conversation.
We did notice because we were focused on the interaction.
We had a conversation before this call about bad Wi-Fi, and that's exactly what happened. My Wi-Fi dropped out. So I only heard the second half of that, sorry. So,
yeah, sure. So if you were tasked with improving a landing page that was converting at 1%, let's imagine that the page is, I'm going to say, bloody awful, even though I don't know where this person is from. There's no social proof, the headline is muddled, and the page loads slowly. Where would you start? Would you test the quote unquote obvious problems, for example, best practices, or would you focus on gathering qualitative and quantitative data before even thinking about what to test? That's from Reese.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And going back to what I said right at the beginning, testing should really be about, trying to further what you're doing from a strategic point of view. So the approach really is to understand what is the point of the landing page. And in order to understand what the point of the landing page is, you need to really understand what the proposition of the product is, how the customers, how they want to interact with you and how they want to interact with the product, because you need to understand what it is that's going to trigger them to be interested in it. So this is a great example of exactly what I'm talking about, is that the things you test should be unique to you. Let's just hypothetically say that the product, I'm going to use a real example. We have a client who sell various different products, but we built a landing page some time ago for an airbed. There's an inflatable bed, and their product page wasn't performing very well. So we decided to build a new landing page for various other reasons. We couldn't do much with the template of the PDP of the landing page on the retail site. And so the very first thing was we wanted to understand what makes this product different. Why do people buy it? Why do they like it? What is it that's going to make them stay here when they've searched for an airbed and clicked on this? What is the point of differentiation? And so that's what you're testing. You're testing, can you increase engagement by getting these kind of key points across? Now that would be very different from just going, so okay, well we'll make the CTA bigger, or these sort of structural functional elements of the page. Now they might work, they absolutely might work. There's nothing at this point to say that what I'm coming up with in terms of these propositional things will be better than some sort of functional element of the site or of the layout. But if you're approaching something like that, you should be approaching it from the point of view of understanding what that is strategically to the business, what it means, and what it means to customers and things like that. So yeah, good, just a good example of what I was talking about.
I heard you, I saw you, Jacob, kind of holding, smirking a little bit there. Do you have anything you want to add?
Sure, yeah. So my take on that same question would be, yeah, so assuming, strategy is in place and those discussions took place and everyone's agreed that this is the product to sell and they have the right metrics in line to agree upon, and assuming that that page wants to generate more leads or generate more sales, it goes back to that kind of exploit versus explore trade-off. Do we go completely into unknown, which could be interesting, or do we make a leap? And this is kind of where, I mean, my preference would be to get those, let's call them obvious, but let's call them probable patterns out of the way, and exploit what we have learned in the past. And one quick way of doing that is actually through a leap experiment, where all the things that are highly probable get included in a single variation. We observe that typically increases impact, and therefore that's also a shorter testing duration. If something has a higher impact, it's easier to see, and then move on to the unknowns that are equally interesting.
I love that. Two different ways to look at the same question. Let's take a look here. Okay, so we just came up on half an hour, but it sounds like I don't think Jakub, did you have ask your question to Jonny? Did you have a question for him?
I have some points here to discuss further, like examples of meta-analysis, and maybe that can be turned into some questions if
Sure.
like if these are all valid use cases, or if these are potentially useless or useful.
So let's explore that a bit. Are you game, Jonny? We have a few.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, excellent. Take it away.
So one simple use case, and this goes back to what I mentioned before, like the formal meta-analysis. And I'm admitting I'm not a data scientist nor a taught statistician. I'm very much interested in the topic, and I would love to be more formal about it in the future. But I want to start off with an example where I think we've all done this little informal meta-analysis to some degree, and it's a simple retest, right? So we have an experiment where it's like, okay, it did whatever it did. Maybe it was significant, but someone has a hunch and feeling like, hey, it's still not, I don't know about this. Maybe it was run in December or something, right? So we retested, and we maybe on the same site, maybe the same change. It's very, very similar. Not exactly 100% the same because it's a new time frame and some slightly new audiences, but it's extremely similar. And when we have two outcomes that are maybe similar, again, it worked back in December, it works in March, we kind of add them up together. And I think that's a simple meta-analysis that's informal.
So is that repeating an experiment on the same website?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's interesting, but that's almost like a completely different use case, right? Because that's sort of repeating an experiment to check for generalizability rather than trying to find patterns in across different websites or whatever. So it is a very different kind of use case. Like how would somebody use that? Or do you add? Is that just giving greater weight to the pattern? Or
I think that's an example of where something is very homogeneous, right? We can like the same website, and I think the generalizability increase is very low because it's so similar, right? But I think what we're after is the second part of a meta-analysis, which is a more accurate effect. Right? Some might think that, okay, if it worked in December plus 7% of sales, and in March it was -5, we'd be a little bit hesitant to roll that out, right? Or I don't know, maybe that's only a change to be rolled out during December or something like that. There's other analysis that can happen there, but it's kind of like a aggregation of these two tests that starts happening. Whereas if they're both positive during different time frames, or maybe on different product pages even. So same company, slightly different products, And same thing that happens. We kind of aggregate because we want to have a bit more confidence, I guess, and more accurate estimates.
Mhm.
So that's one use case. Yeah.
Okay.
I see a question here from Michael Johnstone. He's saying, when does the database become outdated and what do you do about that? Is there a risk that successful patterns from 2, 3, 4, or 5 years ago just aren't viable anymore? For example, new technologies, consumer maturity, etc.
It may or may not. It's not a given. Okay. Some things can be, recently we were discussing the same question in Ronnie Kohavi's class, Accelerating Innovation Through A/B Testing. Wonderful class, by the way. And Ronnie shared some graphs of how Bing did over the time, their cumulative graphs of their revenue per search or something like that. And yes, there's ups and downs and peaks and valleys, but the general trend was that the graph didn't fade. It was increasing. We've seen some of that in with some other clients as well. But I think the most honest answer is some things may decline, deteriorate, some things may remain stable, some things may improve. That's my 5 cents.
So it's there's some interesting comments here that I'm seeing, and I don't know if you have that chat window open, but there's here that I think Jonny's approach is much more people-centric and Jakub's is more technical and analytical, and it's very interesting to see the different approaches. And Jonathan's comment here, which I think is interesting, it's difficult to understand how you can generalize on a result when the environment changes so radically. For example, when a scientific meta-analysis is produced, usually because it's expensive to test in lab settings or because your sample sizes are tiny, for example, rare diseases, it feels like it's incredibly risky to be using the results of similar but not identical tests on t-shirts, donuts, double glazing, and laptops to inform how you should sell cars. Comments?
Yeah, so I think the thing about people-centric and technical is not quite right. I mean, I guess like I approach experimentation from a people-centric point of view. However, then the experimentation aspect of it is technical. Like, we're coming up with ideas using research and particularly using sort of people-centric strategy and an idea of profit strategy and brand strategy and things like that. But then we're testing in a very sort of robust technical way. I guess actually my question about meta-analysis database is the reason that I don't necessarily believe it's of value in some instances is that I don't think it is as robustly technical as it would appear to be. For interestingly, the reasons that Jonathan Crowder is saying here, that it sort of seems like it is a very technical statistical thing. However, there are so many problems around it to do with audiences and differences and things like that it probably doesn't actually do what it's meant to do in some cases, not in all cases.
I think, if I may add, I think there's an assumption that you can only meta-analyze identical experiments. And technically, identical experiments, I'd say they don't exist. Even when you rerun the same, unless I don't know, maybe one could imagine some pristine physics experiment where everything is exactly the same. Even the time frame will be different there, right? So philosophically, there might be some tiny differences. And yeah.
think actually, if I'm thinking aloud now, but really, I think that what good UI is and what you're doing with it would not, I wouldn't necessarily change it, but I think you could add a layer of value on it by sort of almost making it into a sort of community type sort of social, not really social network. What I'm getting at is like what I mentioned earlier before briefly, is that there's a lot of value in people sharing experiments that they've done and their assumptions about them. And I think a lot of people are interested in sort of debating those things and saying, you know, we ran this experiment and this was the outcome. It's unusual. What do you think? And then, you know, people love to get involved with that sort of stuff and go, well, I think, you know, it could mean this, it could mean that. And there's quite a lot of value in that sort of sharing of experiments and having a kind of a forum to share those experiments, because really the interesting part is the storytelling that goes around it and the debate that goes around it, around with UX and things like that. So there's actually, like, you know, to have a base of a database of experiments and a place where people will input experiments and share them and talk about them would have a lot of value. But I just think that the attempt to sort of make statistical patterns out of it, it wouldn't be as valuable as that. That's just my view.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, subject communities, and that touches like peer review. People talk about, you know, try to tackle experiments from different angles and run checks on each other. I think that's completely valid. I also, want to stretch this beyond good UI. This is not just about, you know, what I'm doing, but I would encourage, I mean, to your earlier point, like, you know, there's something about you wanting to start a database, but kind of lost interest or something like that. I would encourage companies to build more of an institutional memory and keep track of certain patterns, either specific or general. There's certain tools, I think, that are starting to tag certain tests as even as broad as a social proof, right? So there's this very wide angle, or sorry, like lens through which tests can be thrown in as social proof. And then they could be very, very precise. You know, a testimonial on on a product page, or a testimonial on a checkout page, and those in itself, once we zoom in on those, they also might have different outcomes, right? But that social element of sharing, I think that happens also either way. Certain companies roll out certain right, make changes, or hear about each other's experiments. There's cases of I think 10 years ago or so, I can't remember who was first, but whether it was Bing or Booking or opening stuff in new tabs. And that has, anecdotally, I've heard of these tests being rerun and working for completely different companies across the globe, including some of our own. We actually have a pattern as well where some people were inspired by that and they tried that opening a new tab interaction on listing pages, and it replicated. So sharing, I think, contains probabilities, and I think it's worthwhile to capture those for numerous reasons.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to tie it up, where you came up to 45 minutes. I would just like to button this up with a nice little bow. If each of you could give a sentence or two about what you would like the audience to take away or maybe think about in their experimentation journey, that would be excellent. Jonny, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think I guess a part of what I see as my mission really is to change the way people think about what experimentation, what CRO is, and where I see it going from is just, you know, churning through little ideas to it actually being something that services business direction and things like that. One of the things I often say to people in these situations is, think about how anything great happened. Like, nothing great that happened in the history of civilization, modern civilization, did so without the scientific method and process, getting to the moon and all that sort of stuff. And what happened was they had a vision, and they used experimentation to piecemeal step towards that vision. That is the opportunity for experimentation. A business is an entity with a vision, and you can help it get there with experimentation. But what actually happens is people just churn around loads of ideas about changing the size of a box and things like that. So that is, that's what I would want people to take away, is think about how experimentation can help answer bigger questions.
I love that. Jacob?
I think experimentation has a sibling, knowledge generation. And if we, again, I would encourage everyone to default to run experiments and validate their hypothesis, because, again, predicting is very difficult and we get surprised. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool. But if we forget what those experiments generated, and if we forget about this, the ability to create knowledge, as many professions do, military, medicine, every day, we will be rerunning the same experiments. So encoding the outcomes of multiple experiments as patterns, as heuristics, some better, some worse, some better in certain situations, some meh in certain situations, right? Is very, very valuable, and I would say professional as well, to share that knowledge and inspire others with it, either to run more experiments, or sometimes, if they don't have the time, sometimes to act on it.
All right. So without further ado, if anyone here or listening to the recording has any follow-up questions, what's the best way to reach you, Jonny?
LinkedIn, probably. So, and also, if anybody doesn't already follow me on LinkedIn, then please do, or connect to me. I talk about all this sort of stuff all the time. So, just drop me a note on LinkedIn.
Okay, perfect. And for you, Jacob?
Same. I love LinkedIn and chatting with Jonny on, there as well, agreeing most of the time, sometimes not, but yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to both of you for taking part in the first episode of what's hopefully many for Conversion Conversations. And it was really lovely to put you in the same room and to really get this back and forth in real time, rather than liking and applauding on LinkedIn. So that was excellent. Thanks for your insights. And thank you very much to all of you for attending. If you have any ideas about who you'd like to see or what topics you'd like us to cover, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well and drop me a line, and we will definitely distill those and come up with something that is going to get you excited and learning in a new and dynamic way. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their quarter. Take care, everyone. Bye.